Welcome back to Nothing But the Truth, the show dedicated to exploring the pressing issues facing the Jewish communities here in the United States and in Israel. I'm your host, Trudy Stern, and each week we bring you candid conversations with influential voices who are committed to shedding light on these very important issues. Today, I am honored to have a very special guest joining us, Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, a renowned expert on Middle Eastern politics and terrorism, serving as the senior vice president of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He has a rich background that includes working as a counterterrorism analyst at the United States Department of the Treasury. Jonathan has been at the forefront of analyzing and shaping our understanding of global security issues. He is known for his expertise on Middle Eastern politics, particularly concerning Israel and its security challenges. He often discusses issues like Israeli defense strategies, U.S. Israel relations, and the broader geopolitical dynamics in the region. He's the author of many books, many influential books, including The State of Failure and The Forever War, where he dives deep into the complexities of the U.S. foreign policy and its implications. Jonathan's insights are invaluable, and today he'll help us navigate some of the most pressing challenges facing Israel and the United States. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Schanzer. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for being here. Really, we are so honored to have you, particularly at this very, very unbelievably pivotal moment in both the United States and in Israel's life. We are now on the cusp of an election, so we are in very lame duck type of waters, where some have said we are at the most dangerous moment. I'm not sure if you can speak to that. We just had a leak from somebody in the government regarding Israel's movements regarding Iran. Israel just retaliated against Iran's strike. Iran struck Israel. So there's so much to get to. To begin with, I would just quickly, what is your thoughts on whether or not Iran used everything that they have in attacking Israel? And so if you could just speak to that.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Look, the Iranians have a lot more in the tank, unfortunately. The Israelis did a great job, I think, the other night on Friday night of striking a lot of core assets belonging to the regime, specifically going after their air defense systems to make sure that if Israel needs to go back, they can do so safely or more safely, depending on how many of those air defense assets still remain. But they got a lot of radars and they got some of the missile batteries. They were able to really clear the skies for a future attack. But I think probably maybe even more importantly, what we saw was Israel taking out the ballistic missile factories. So in other words, what we've seen from the Iranians firing those ballistic missiles at Israel now twice, once in April, mid-April, and then again in early October. What the Israelis did the other night was they struck at the regime's ability to rebuild those ballistic missiles. It's going to take months for the regime to be able to get those capabilities back. So now whatever Iran has in its arsenal, and I'm not entirely clear how many ballistic missiles they have, but let's say it's 1,000 or 2,000 or whatever the number is, they're going to have to start counting them a lot more carefully. When they attacked Israel 2 times before, they were working under the assumption that they could always make more of them. Now they can't. But I think more importantly, what the Israelis have shown is that they can now go back into Iran and strike things that are of greater value to the regime beyond just the ballistic missile construction. But they could go after their oil assets, their energy assets, the moneymaker for the regime, basically the assets that help Iran fuel its war machine. That can be targeted next time around. Nuclear sites, can be targeted next time around. So the Israelis have sent a very clear message. If you do this again, you're going to pay a steep, steep price. But I think, again, as I noted, the war is far from over. Iran still has lots of capabilities. If they want to fire back, they can. I just think the Israelis have made it very clear that if they do, they're going to be very sorry for it. And I would expect there to be, I mean, look, this, as you mentioned, this is a dangerous time. We're in a lame duck period in Washington, and there you could argue that, okay, well, no one's really home at the White House. A little bit of confusion in terms of who's in power during these 2 to 3 months. But I will say also the Israelis, I think, get the sense that if they need to do more, if they need to respond with greater strength, with greater firepower during this lame duck period, they'll be able to do it. And there's very little that the Iranians could do to stop them.
Well, okay, so there was a leak that we heard about.
Yeah.
So do you think that that had a major effect on Israel's response? And if you could just talk about the leak for a second, maybe some of the listeners, aren't aware of it.
Sure. Well, I guess about it was a week and a half ago now, there was a leak that appeared on a Telegram channel that appeared to actually detail a little bit of Israel's capabilities, maybe their intent, some of their targets. It was clear through this classified document. It was a top secret document that was meant for Five Eyes countries. So basically the US, UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. They were the only countries that should have seen this at a very high level. It gets leaked. It implies that Israel has nuclear capabilities. It implies some of the targets that Israel may or may not have been thinking about. My understanding, talking to Israelis after the fact, is that, that there were maybe 2 things that came of it. One, that the Israelis are now much more careful about what they share and when they share it with the U.S. There's a lot of concern right now about how additional information might leak. And we've heard other stories about other possible leaks over the last couple of months. For example, Hezbollah getting advance warning about an Israeli incursion into Lebanon. These are the things that they keep happening. And there's an underlying problem here, obviously, that somewhere within the so-called deep state in Washington, we've got people that are working against Israeli interests. They're trying to undermine the U.S. Israel relationship. That is going to need to be addressed no matter who is president. They're going to have to figure all of this out because, look, as somebody who used to work with a clearance, there are rules. And if you break those rules, at minimum, you lose your job. Maximum, you go to jail. And we need to figure out exactly who's leaking this stuff and why. And right now we know the FBI is on this, but they need to move quicker because this war is not ending anytime soon. And we need to figure out the source of these leaks. So that's the sort of the first component of the leak, is the trust factor. And then there was the question of what did it do to Israel? From what I understand, it didn't change much in terms of Israel's targets. I think it may have postponed the strike by a few days, but it also, according to some folks I've heard, it may have sped it up. And I don't know if we'll ever get like a clear answer on this. On the one hand, the Israelis might have said, okay, well, now that the Iranians know what we might hit, we need to change the strike packages here or there. But then there's the other school of thought that says, okay, Biden administration, you let this leak. You wanted us to wait until after the election. We're no longer agreeing to do that. And we're going to speed up this strike. And we're going to do this even with 2 weeks left to go before the election. And I don't know what the answer is here. I don't know where the truth lies. But I think we can probably be safe in saying that it postponed Israel's strike by a couple of days, but then it may have sped it up or it may have just gone ahead according to plan.
So lots have happened with regard to Israel demolishing Hamas, Yahya Sinwar being murdered and being killed, and it seems like Hezbollah has been weakened also. Can you talk to us a little bit about the different fronts of war that Israel is facing and what is the state of play right now?
Sure. Well, there's seven fronts that are going on. If you don't count the media environment here, maybe that's an eighth front, or cyber warfare, that might be ninth, or campus could be 10th for that matter. And we could look at a lot of fronts that are taking place all around the world. But the kinetic fronts, as we would call them, the wars that Israel is fighting right now, they are on seven fronts. One front, I think, is largely diminished, and that is the Gaza one. That was the longest front. It was, I think, always going to be the one that was going to be the most painful. And that took 11 months. You could even argue, up to 13 before Sinwar was killed. But we're seeing really the leadership of Hamas is eviscerated. 23 out of 24 brigades are destroyed. 18,000 or more Hamas fighters killed, many more injured, many more in jail. This is not the same terrorist organization that attacked Israel on 10/7 of last year. And I think we can safely say that they're not coming back anytime soon. It's going to take a decade or more for this group to rebuild. So I think that's the good news. Maybe in the other good news front, we do see that Hezbollah is diminished. They still are able, should be clear, they're able to fire off 200 plus rockets and missiles at Israel per day. That's a lot. And we're seeing direct hits on Israeli targets. We're seeing people killed. We're seeing people injured. That's obviously not good. The good news, though, is that at one point there was fear that Hezbollah would be able to fire 2,000 or 3,000 rockets a day. That is not happening any longer. The leadership is almost all gone. A lot of the missile capabilities have been eroded or destroyed. So there's a lot, I think, that the Israelis are thankful for, even as this tough war continues to drag on. But we knew that that was always going to be a possibility here, that Hezbollah was, I mean, they joined in this war on October 8th, and they haven't stopped fighting since. Now, in a few other places, I mean, obviously, Iran's one of those fronts. Well, it remains to be seen whether they have the chutzpah to try to fire back at Israel after the attacks that Israel just launched over the weekend. I think a good message was sent, but look, this regime could be somewhat suicidal, right? They have they have an old supreme leader. The guy's in his late 80s. And he may be thinking this is his last chance to try to destroy Israel before he dies. Rumors have it that he's critically ill. That he's not going to last much longer. And so he may be thinking it's time to go all in here. But I think in general, Iran looks like it's been exposed as a weaker force than anyone maybe thought it was at the start of this war. And then that leaves us with four other fronts. You've got the Houthis in Yemen. They continue to fire sporadically, but not in a consistent way. It's not a strategic threat to Israel. It's not an existential threat to Israel. It's an annoyance, and it can be deadly. But the hope anyway is that the U.S. has started to strike in Yemen to take out some of those Houthi assets. Let's hope they continue to do that. This would be a good way for the U.S. to contribute to the war effort from afar without having to put a boot on the ground in Israel, as it were. Then we have two other fronts that I think are similar in that way. That's Iraq and Syria. They have Shiite militias there that continue to pester Israel. And by the way, pester the United States. In one case, we saw the death of 3 U.S. servicemen back in February. Now, the U.S. has responded, and I think maybe has chastened these militias a little bit, and we may see a trailing off of their attacks. But the one that I actually worry about, I saved this one for last, the seventh front, is the one that really could blow up at any time, and that's the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. This is the place where I think Iran has the most amount of assets. They've got a bunch of different terrorist groups that they've been funding and arming and training. There's been a smuggling problem into the West Bank from Jordan. The Iranians have been flooding that area with weapons and cash and fighters. And so we're watching that very carefully. The IDF is operating there almost every night, trying to dismantle and to diffuse a lot of the tension there. But the Iranians keep throwing more and more at Israel. I would say that apart from Hezbollah, where we see those 200 plus rockets per day landing in Israel or getting shot down, that's probably the third most worrisome front right now as far as direct impact. Long term, though, we obviously all eyes on Iran itself. If they continue to fire those ballistic missiles, Israel's going to have to go back again with another long distance, multi-phased operation from the air.
So, first of all, for all of those listeners who are joining late, thank you for coming to our show. And we have a very honored guest, Dr. Jonathan Schanzer. I want to turn now to America's response, or how they have affected what has gone on in this region. We have the history of how the Trump administration handled Iran, and we have 4 years of how the Biden-Harris administration has handled Iran, and we have seen different results. And I want you to speak to the different ways to handle Iran as an evil terror sponsor in that region, and whether or not America had an impact on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's interesting. I think it was trial and error during the Trump years, right? We had incredible sanctions that had been put on the regime, and it really squeezed the regime's ability to fund the terror organizations. And that was a stark contrast to what happened before Trump came in, because Obama had relieved a lot of those sanctions and gave the Iranian regime something like $150 billion in cash and sanctions relief, which, of course, would end up flowing into the coffers of Iran, rather of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. In other words, what the Obama team did is they essentially funded the war that Israel's fighting right now, and that the U.S. is fighting right now on some of these fronts. When Trump came in, we saw the imposition of sanctions. They got out of the nuclear deal. I think it was largely the right move to make. There was probably a moment where I think the region got a little scared, and that was after the attack that the Iranians carried out on the Abqaiq oil facility in Saudi Arabia. The Trump administration kind of balked. They didn't respond directly to that attack. But then a couple of months later, we saw the Trump administration do something that no one ever thought, which was to kill Qasem Soleimani, the head of the IRGC Quds Force, the most senior terrorist within Iran's ranks. And that was a clarifying moment, I think, for the regime. It was a clarifying moment in the region. Trump had always been seen as someone who was a bit of a wild card. Nobody knew what he was going to do next. The Iranians were, I think, at one point afraid of him. Then maybe they let down their guard and they tested him, and they found out what happens when you test the Trump administration. They showed them that this was a brutal, brutal response. And I think that chastened the regime for a while. We saw them holding back on some of the aggression that they had been known for. But then you have the Biden administration come in, and immediately they began to talk about resuming negotiations for a nuclear deal, the same deal that Trump had gotten out of. They relaxed some of the sanctions. And that, of course, I think probably fed into the regime's ability to fund and arm and train all of the proxies that we just discussed on these 7 fronts: Hamas and Hezbollah, the groups in the West Bank, the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, the Houthis. They were all benefiting. When Iran benefits, they benefit. This is the way that Iran operates. The regime there is the #1 state sponsor of terror. So financially, I think it was a huge mistake. We gave them breathing room. But then there's the other part of it, which is, what has the U.S. response been to the military aggression? And there, I have to say, the Biden administration has not done what it needed to do. The regime knows that if it's threatened, then it needs to stop. Whatever it's doing, if it's being threatened, it will stop. We never threatened this regime. Over this last 4 years, the threats were veiled. They may have been issued behind closed doors. They were coupled with offers to return to the negotiating table. This was a mistake, in my view, because what it did is it gave the regime the impression that it can continue to carry out this multi-front war against Israel and the United States with impunity. And that's what I think we're seeing now. It's a mistake. The regime is watching our election very closely right now, because they probably, I think in their minds, they see 2 choices. the return of the guy that killed Qasem Soleimani, or the vice president of the guy that allowed them to get away literally with murder for the last year in the Middle East. And so I think they're watching that very closely. We've heard, by the way, that they've tried to influence the elections. We've heard that they've been financing some of the chaos on campus. We've heard that they may even be behind some of the assassination attempts against the former president himself, against Donald Trump, but also against some of his advisors and senior people. So we're watching Iran very carefully right now, especially in the wake of that Israeli attack. Do they want to try to get revenge against the U.S.? Because we know the U.S. was at least aware and perhaps even advising on the attacks that Israel carried out the other night against Iran.
So that is a great analysis. So thank you for that. We hear now that going forward, and I've heard this many times from many different experts, that we are possibly on the verge of World War III. Is that true? Is that a fact? Is that not a fact? Can you
Yeah,
speak?
it's not a fact. It's not a fact, but I will say that the indicators are scary because when you think about it, we probably are closer to World War III than we were a year ago or 3 years ago. Right? I mean, when you think about it, it was 2022, that was Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And that started a war that was right on the edge of Europe. And then you got 2023, you have the 10/7 attacks. This is Iran waging a war against Israel, again on 7 fronts. So now what you have is 2 different wars that are being fought. A lot of people try to disconnect the dots. Let me just explain, though, that the Russians and the Iranians are working together. They share, they share weapon systems, they share intelligence, they provide each other diplomatic support. There's a significant amount of trade. You know, one of the things that's really interesting is like when the Houthis attack ships in the Red Sea, Russian ships get an exemption. They're able to travel safely there, right? The drones that Russia is using in Ukraine are Iranian made. The air defense systems that Iran tried to use to knock Israeli fighter jets out of the sky the other night, those are Russian S-300 systems. These guys work together. Now, there's another wrinkle to all of this, which is that the Chinese Communist Party, Beijing, is actually also thinking about its own war. We know that they've had their eyes on Taiwan for quite some time. And the Chinese work closely with the Russians and the Iranians and the North Koreans, by the way, who just deployed forces to fight on behalf of Russia in Ukraine. So you begin to see that there's an axis forming, not unlike the axis that we saw in World War II. And you could imagine that this axis could solidify further. This is why I will continue to argue that it is in the best interest of the United States to let Israel win against Iran, to let Ukraine win against Russia. This administration has been trying to hold back the Israelis and the Ukrainians, telling them that there's certain kinds of attacks that they can't carry out, withholding certain kinds of weapons to both of these countries, when what we need to do is to give them every tool that is even possible to use on the battlefield to destroy these enemies before they can form that axis in a way that threatens U.S. interests and the way that would threaten the U.S.-led world order. So the Biden administration, in my view, has been far too tentative here. It'll be interesting to see whether the outgoing president takes advantage of this lame duck period and perhaps empowers our allies. But if he doesn't, it's a huge mistake. And then we'll have to see what happens. But, you know, this is one of the reasons why this election is so incredibly consequential right now. We need a president who is going to give it to this axis. They need to make sure that this axis feels more afraid than it has over the last 2 years, because over the last 2 years, they have not been afraid at all.
Do you think that the pullout of Afghanistan had some sort of impact on how this axis of evil views America?
Absolutely. There's no question that the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan. I mean, look, what the Biden administration did, it was just one of the most simplistic mistakes. They pulled out the military before they pulled out the political personnel, as well as the Afghan people that had been helping. And so there were all these people who are left behind. And it was a calamity. It looked so disorderly, it looked chaotic. And when you cannot pull off something as simple as an orderly withdrawal, of course, they were doing it under fire, which, I mean, I would say it was probably a mistake to leave Afghanistan in the first place. But if you're going to leave, do it in a way that shows that you have a competent military that understands the most basic step-by-step approach to a withdrawal of that nature. And instead, what we saw was a disaster. It was an embarrassment for, for a superpower to go through something like that. And we know that Vladimir Putin has looked on and said, America looks weak. This is probably the time. And I would argue that probably the Iranians said the same. Like, look, we don't have a crazy man in the White House who's killing Qasem Soleimani. We have someone who actually wants to throw money at us to make a deal. So maybe this is the right time to attack Israel. And I would probably venture a guess that that was part of their calculus. I think there were other things that went into this as well, certainly on the Iranian side, where they saw the chaos inside Israel, the sort of the domestic tumult that was happening there as a result of judicial reform. But look, from Putin's perspective, I think he looked on and said, you know what? The U.S. does not look like it has the same backbone that it did before. This is the time to try to conquer territory that Russia's always wanted. I'm fairly certain that was Putin's perspective at the time.
Iran also got hundreds of billions of dollars that were. You mentioned the sanction waivers, but that resulted in a tremendous amount of money to the Iranian government, enabling them to actually support the terror all around. So I would think that would be a differential between the two administrations also.
Yeah, I think so. We know that there are a lot of folks in the sort of the Harris team that were part of the original JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the original nuclear deal from 2015. There is some orthodoxy, I would argue, within that team about trying to go back always to that place. That was sort of the high water mark, at least as they see it in the the Obama administration. They're all looking to get back into the deal. And I would be very concerned about that. Phil Gordon is Kamala Harris's national security advisor. He was one of the key architects of the deal. He is opposed to trying to bring down the regime in Iran. He's opposed to challenging the regime in Iran. And I'm worried because, as we all know, the national security advisor is a position that the president does not need Senate approval for. It can be, the president gets to call that shot, and that's a hugely important position and one that I'm very worried about right now. But broadly speaking, I am worried about, I'm worried about the trends of either appeasing Iran or of isolationism, right? That can be popular on both sides of the aisle right now in different ways. I think it's important to note. But this idea, and I think we really see a lot of it right now that, America is not a force for good. America does not need to stand up for its allies. And that is a very dangerous perspective to have going into a new administration.
Well, I want to thank you for giving our listeners all of this valuable information, particularly as we head into this week of early voting. And I urge all of our listeners to please go and early vote. You've now heard that the issues are so incredibly important and critical for Israel and the United States. Jonathan, you've laid out some really, really unbelievably important and frightening concerns. We see two completely different paths that our country and Israel could face given the different choices in this election. And I thank you for really giving us all of that information. I hope all of our listeners took that in and will go to the ballot boxes early, vote early, and have Israel at your heart. Before we wrap up, I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to you. You were amazing. Your insights are invaluable. The commitment to these issues that face the Jewish community obviously are so important to you, and we appreciate you taking the time to share your perspective with us. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope today's discussion has provided you with valuable insights and deeper understanding of the issues at hand. Be sure to tune in next week for another compelling issue of Nothing But the Truth. But until then, take care, keep questioning the narrative. Together, we can all make a difference. Thank you so much for listening.